Welcome to episode 2 of the WAN Manager podcast. I'm your host, Bryan from TeleGeography, and today we're doing an Ask an Analyst episode. So while some of our episodes are going to be interviews with WAN managers or their vendors, we're also going to take some deep dives on a particular topic where we at TeleGeography have the relevant knowledge and data. So today, we're going to talk about the SD-WAN marketplace and how the vendor landscape and partner ecosystem has kind of developed. So for that, I would like to welcome my colleague, Brianna Boudreau, who is a senior analyst here at TeleGeography and heads up our SD-WAN research service. Welcome, Brianna.
Thanks, Greg. It's good to be with you today.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, I just, like usual, thought that before I got into the questions that I wanted to ask you, I would dive into a few of our WAN Manager survey poll and WAN Summit poll results and just set us up with a little bit of data. So first, on SD-WAN adoption, our 2018 WAN Manager survey was focused all on SD-WAN adoption, and we're updating that for 2020. But so the numbers that we have in the present update are from 2 years ago. So we're expecting some changes here. But back then, under 20% had installed, and another 25% were in the rollout phase. Now, we've, like I said, asked that question again this year, and the installed number certainly has gone up. But it's very preliminary results. We haven't finished running that survey, and we may see those numbers change. But it's around 25 to 30% more like now in terms of those who have installed. And of course, in the meantime, the global pandemic has shut everything down. And we've heard from several folks that their rollouts that they had intended for this year were delayed by the shutdown, either on the vendor side or the enterprise side, or both. Then also we have, like I said, the WAN Summit poll. So we would poll the audience at our WAN Summit events. The last one of those was in 2019, of course. And then we were at about 35% in terms of adoption. And with both of those data sets, I always caution people that it's very likely that our survey and the summit attracts maybe some earlier adopters, so the larger market may be a little bit behind that. Then another thing I want to talk about with you today, Brianna, is vendor type. We asked in 2018 sort of what type of vendors they were using. About 45% of respondents then were going sort of DIY with an SD-WAN vendor direct kind of service. I suspect that's going to have changed by the time we get a full update of this survey. And about 1/3 of them were going with carriers as a managed service. And again, I think that category, even then we expected that category to rise with time. So our preliminary 2020 results, again, these numbers definitely might change over the course of the next few months as we collect more data. But we've already seen that shift solidly to a majority of folks using a carrier rather than going SD-WAN vendor direct. So we'll see if that stays in place as we get more results. And then lastly, specifically about management, in 2018, we got kind of a mixed bag here. So about 1/3 from carriers as a managed service, and kind of mixed on whether they were going with carriers not as a managed service. That was a very small percentage. Or we didn't have an option in that survey as getting it from an SD-WAN vendor as a managed service. So we'll see if that changes with time here. And then we also added in 2020 a co-managed option. And we just didn't have that as a response selection in 2018. So far, that seems to be the winner. So in terms of our survey respondents anyway, co-managed is winning out over both a fully managed kind of service or a DIY vendor direct kind of service. All right. So with that, just to set everything up, I thought, Brianna, we might start out with just like kind of a quick overview of what you do at TeleGeography and specifically what we cover in the product that you manage, the SD-WAN research service.
Sure. So I joined TeleGeography a while ago now, back in 2008, working on the pricing team with you, Greg, covering all of our research areas, really, both on the wholesale side of things with international private line and IP transit pricing, as well as our enterprise research, tracking MPLS and DIA pricing. And a few years ago was kind of tasked with figuring out how we should cover SD-WAN when we started to hear more about it at the WAN Summit and from the different enterprises that we were talking about. So I've been heading up that for a few years now. And originally, that product just really sought to profile what the different offerings were because everyone had a little bit of a different take on SD-WAN. And we wanted to be able for WAN managers to take a look across the services, how to compare the different service features, what were the common elements, what distinguished certain providers. And it's kind of morphed into the profiles along with a market analysis and most recently pricing. So
We are
tracking,
pricing analysts ultimately,
we
right?
are exactly.
Since 2008, I forget how long it's been, but yeah, absolutely, yeah,
Time flies, actually, when
yeah.
I think about it. So yeah, the SD-WAN pricing's really gained traction. We've got a lot of participants in it. It's up there with all the MPLS pricing for the number of participants now. So it's been really great to see that evolve for sure.
Yeah, certainly. And from my perspective, a lot of folks are familiar with. I did a long blog series on this about moving from like kind of all MPLS to an SD-WAN hybrid kind of network with internet involved and that sort of thing. And it's been really helpful to have the SD-WAN numbers to add on top of that. So thank you for spearheading that. So, all right. I figured first, before we get to the pricing, we'd talk just about like the vendor marketplace. So one of the first things you run into when you're talking about SD-WAN, especially in those first few years, is what is SD-WAN and who gets to call themselves an SD-WAN vendor? Is it whatever they were doing before, but with a new name, or is there a sort of specific definition of course, our friends at MEF have taken that over in a sort of comprehensive way, and perhaps in a future episode we'll get Pascal Meneses or someone like that to take us on a really deep dive in that. But just for the purposes of the SD-WAN Research Service and the work you've done, I was wondering if you can give us a kind of basic definition of who gets included in our data as an SD-WAN vendor.
Sure. MEF certainly is making it a lot easier with outlining all of the things that different vendors need to offer to be considered SD-WAN. But originally, we tried to create a very basic, if you can say basic, definition of SD-WAN a few years ago. And that really is a service that combines traffic prioritization, management, and security functions into a network overlay that's centrally controlled and transport independent. So to kind of break that down, you've got your SD-WAN appliances or software that augment the CPEs at all your network sites, and they route traffic over different network connections based on performance criteria. WAN
Mm-hmm.
managers can pre-configure those criteria in their centralized controller, and then traffic is routed based on which links meet those performance standards that they've set. So that's
Right.
not exactly basic, but what we could boil it down to.
Yeah, that's good enough. Absolutely. So using that definition, then I think the next thing that folks run into is that there are dozens of those providers out there. So if you're a WAN manager or IT staff trying to sort through that marketplace, it's pretty easy to become confused. Um, so while there's a lot of those SD-WAN providers and different SD-WAN offerings, even from the same providers out there, there's definitely doesn't seem to be one size fits all. So could you walk us through, again, from your view and how we cover it, the types of SD-WAN services and providers that are out there in the marketplace?
Sure. I think really to do that, you need to take a look first at a company's approach and then their background. So really the two different approaches we've seen SD-WAN vendors take is an over-the-top provider. They deliver the hardware and software that overlay your existing network infrastructure. And that is a majority of the SD-WAN vendors that we profile in our research.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few others that have taken a network-based approach, like Ariaka Networks and Cato Networks jump to mind. And they also provide the SD-WAN appliances, but they utilize their own private network. And so that delivers the service. Their SD-WAN appliances are routing traffic over their global backbone rather than the network you may already have.
Right. So
And
they're acting like your carrier, as overlay and underlay are kind of a single service, whereas in every other case you might be able to get your overlay from one provider, your underlay from multiple providers, whatever the case may be, mix and match. Right. So
exactly. So all the vendors we profile, they fall into one of those two categories, but a majority, again, are that over-the-top solution. And taking
got
a
it.
look at the different providers out there, also their background comes into play. We found that really you may combine those different approaches, but you fall into one of a few categories. And the first, you'll see your incumbent network providers like a Cisco or Juniper Networks that have
Mm-hmm.
long had a history in manufacturing network equipment. They've got the scale to ship these SD-WAN appliances all around the world. And then you may see other WAN service companies. Earlier you said, is this just a service they're tacking on to previous expertise? And some are. For example, we've seen Fortinet gain a lot of traction with their secure SD-WAN service this year, but they have a background in security. Or Riverbed, which previously specialized in WAN optimization. That's a key feature of their SD-WAN solution. And
Right.
finally, you kind of had these pure play SD-WAN startups like a Viptela, a VeloCloud, CloudGenix that really, they specialized in performance-based routing, and that was the root of their service. Now, a lot of those have since been acquired by different providers, but the pure play SD-WAN vendors were the third category that we saw starting out.
Got it. Right. And there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe even some kind of interplay. So an SD-WAN provider might be working with a security provider to bring security into their SD-WAN service, but still from a sort of SD-WAN vendor perspective, not from a security vendor perspective.
Yes, a lot of the vendors that we profile actually do partner with the security vendors to bring in like a next generation firewall service or other cloud-based security features. If they really do specialize more in just the SD-WAN performance-based routing, they'll go partner with the security vendor.
Got it. Makes sense. Okay, so given that varied landscape and understanding, I think a little better that that the particular SD-WAN service you get might relate to the background of that provider, and that there's dozens of them out there, some of them even sort of just pure play startups. Our primary audience here is more the enterprise size multinational sites across the globe, maybe at least dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of different sites. And given this explosion of providers, I think a concern that we hear from these kinds of WAN managers from these large enterprises is they want to make sure that the vendor they select is going to be around in a few years, can operate sort of on a large international scale like that. So obviously, TeleGeography, we're always very neutral in terms of picking winners and losers. We're happy to provide people with information to make up their mind there. So I know you can't get too sort of specific here, but who do you see as kind of the leaders of the pack in terms of the likelihood that they're going to be around in a few years and not be acquired by someone else, and the ability to maybe serve a broad international kind of audience like that? Can you name some specific vendors that you see as at the top of the game, maybe?
Sure. And understandable that enterprises wouldn't want to roll out something that will not be able to be supported within just a few short years after making that investment. But the way I personally think about it is you've seen a lot of carriers or telcos partner with these SD-WAN vendors over the past few years to offer a managed service. And there really are a few key SD-WAN vendors that a majority of them have partnered with. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a slim likelihood that any of those would not be around in a few years if they're going into these partnerships with global telecom providers. So, for example, Cisco, both with their Viptela and Meraki product, VMware with their purchase of VeloCloud, Nuage Networks, and Versa Networks are actually kind of the top four that we've seen in terms of carrier announcements that they have partnered with these SD-WAN vendors to offer a managed service.
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
if I'll break in there for 1 second, just say for what it's worth, I on my side of the telegeography house, I talk to a lot of the WAN managers directly, whereas you're doing a lot of talking to the vendor side. And there's it's definitely true on the WAN manager side. I hear those names mentioned by the folks that we're talking to a lot. There's no doubt about it. So
and there certainly are a lot of other SD-WAN vendors um, out there that are well established, but those are kind of
mhm.
the household names when you're looking at managed services. And then I mentioned Fortinet a little bit earlier, but they're one that in the past year we asked the carriers who they're partnering with, and they broke into our top 10 this year. So
Mm,
that was
mhm,
interesting to see.
mhm.
I know security has been kind of top of mind for everyone
Right.
recently.
Yeah, and that large marketplace of SD-WAN vendors, there's a lot of niches in the WAN market for smaller, SME, maybe even there's space now for SD-WAN to be utilized by Soho kind of, small office, home office kind of stuff.
Yep.
So, but again, strictly speaking about the sort of large multinational enterprise, I think it can narrow your choices down from those 75 or so vendors to the ones that are focused on that market, perhaps.
Right.
Today's episode is brought to you by the WAN Manager Digest. This exclusive subscription service is for enterprise professionals who manage large corporate networks. What it does is it bundles our most popular WAN resources into one toolbox with a single login. So here's what you get: key findings from TeleGeography's Cloud and WAN Infrastructure Report, excerpts from TeleGeography's SD-WAN Research Service, network services pricing updates, analysis from our new WAN Manager survey, and of course, field reports from the latest WAN Summit events. You can get more information about that at telegeography.com or click the link in today's show notes to learn more. So I'm back here talking with Brianna Boudreau, my longtime colleague at TeleGeography. We've been working together on the pricing team a long time, but today we're talking specifically about our SD-WAN research service. And we kind of talked already, Brianna, about the vendor marketplace and what counts as an SD-WAN vendor and that sort of thing. But now everyone who hasn't yet adopted SD-WAN, which according to the numbers that we're seeing, is still a majority of the market. And again, our respondents might be even a little bit ahead of the curve. So really, there's quite a bit of room for SD-WAN adoption, which I think is going to go very quickly over the next few years. All those people are sitting there trying to decide, even if it's not from among 75 or so vendors like we discussed a few minutes ago, but from at least among half a dozen or so vendors that could do their multinational overlay. Um, how do you make those decisions, right? So in our previous 2018 WAN Manager survey, I mentioned that vendor direct was the most popular option. Again, I think that's among the early adopters and is very likely to change. We've already seen that change in our preliminary 2020 survey update. So, what is your view on where the market might shift to? Are more enterprises going to go for the carrier partnership kind of overlay solution, or do you think we're going to still see a lot of folks getting their underlay however they do and buying the overlay directly from the SD-WAN vendor?
Personally, I do think we'll see that shift towards a managed SD-WAN service. I mean, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the original deployments, as you mentioned, were DIY, and that's because for a long time, independent SD-WAN vendors are the only option that was available.
Right,
When we
right. So if you're an early adopter, you have to just go to, well, first of all, there was a time when Viptela wasn't even Cisco, and I don't know if they had
exactly.
customers yet then, but I think so, right? Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely.
And just as an example, like in 2017, when we launched the research service, there were only 11 carriers that had rolled out their own SD-WAN service, and now we profile over 70. So it really is,
Right.
everyone's jumped on board. It's just made it a lot more widely available and accessible, perhaps,
And
for
let me
some of
just
those.
clarify. Sorry, let me just clarify one thing you said there, so that we absolutely get what you're saying.
Yep.
In terms of carriers having their own service, you mean mostly carriers having service that they're selling, but it's through a different vendor. There's only a few carriers, correct me if I'm wrong, that actually develop their own SD-WAN service. It's only a couple or so, right? Or does that even still happen?
Uh, it's very few. I think Tata
Right.
comes to mind with their ISO solution and
Hmm.
HGC Global, but I think those are some of the only ones that have. Most roll them out via channel partnership with
Right.
one of the
Right.
SD-WAN vendors we kind of talked about earlier. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Got it. I just wanted to make sure that I had that right. And even from someone like Tata that developed the ISO solution, I assume you can probably get some other channel partnership service through Tata if they are your underlay provider and you want SD WAN too, right? So
you can. A lot of the
yeah,
telcos that we profile, they've partnered with multiple SD-WAN vendors to be able to really offer a
right.
custom managed solution to their enterprise customers.
Yeah, so that way, if you're already using them as your underlay provider, then you still have quite a bit of choice in terms of the right fit from an SD WAN overlay perspective. So you can choose from the major enterprise services providers out there have channel partnerships with all the big SD WAN providers, right?
Right. And that may be a selling feature for some smaller companies that want that centralized management of multiple services. They want SD-WAN, but they also want other services that telco offers, like direct connects to cloud service providers, consolidated billing, whereas some of your early adopters for SD-WAN or even larger companies, that may not be a selling feature. They may want the ability to deploy and manage the service in-house.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
I do think in the future we will see managed SD-WAN become a bigger part of the market.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I certainly think that in our interviews, for example, with the WAN managers who have filled out a 2020 survey, most of them have been going with a managed solution. I've even heard quite a few carriers mention that they'll sell a managed SD WAN solution without even selling the underlay. So getting your it is at least an option that you could get a managed solution from a carrier with a global IT staff and that sort of thing, 24/7 coverage, without even having the underlay provided by that carrier. So
It is. We kind of have a box to check off in the profile for bring your own connectivity. Like, is this an option for those enterprise customers? But
right,
I
right.
guess
Which this is really interesting. We'll see. We'll see if that lasts. I
it
don't know.
seems counterintuitive, but it
Yeah,
is an option for sure. One
yeah.
question I kind of had for you, Greg, actually, was
Hmm.
that we're gearing up to do start sending out the profiles for review of the SD-WAN vendors, and we've been doing some calls, and a service provider that offers both an unmanaged and an unmanaged solution was saying they've seen things shift towards managed, but it's a little bit slower than they originally thought it would be. So they were glad that they offered
Mm-hmm.
both. I guess during your interviews, has that ever come up? How quickly the market is shifting?
Yeah, it has in this. I mean, when I'm talking to an individual, it's very much up to that sort of what that individual's opinion is, right? So, but a lot of the decision making process on their end comes down to they definitely feel in many cases as though they could manage their SD-WAN service, right? So, in other words, you've got a really smart person who's in charge of this IT infrastructure team at a major corporation. It's just a matter of whether they can convince the CTO, as it were, right, that that they are interested in managing a 24/7 kind of operation, right? So the what the carriers or even the vendors that might offer a managed service can bring to the table is that they already have all of these global coverage kind of knocks in place. They're already managing this with a team of engineers that have the know-how of their particular software um, around the globe with total coverage. And so why replicate that even if you do have the expertise and that sort of thing? Now, there are, it's a minority, but there's other folks that we've talked to that just can't abide the idea of not having a degree of control over that, which I think is why we're seeing emerging in our current survey update, the kind of co-managed solution where there are some things that you don't want to have to be responsible for, especially things like the 24/7 kind of coverage, but you still want to have, you don't want to give that over entirely to the carrier, right? So I
It's kind of the
think
best
that's,
of both worlds.
yeah, that my suspicion is that's what's going to emerge as a popular option for a lot of enterprise IT teams, IT infrastructure teams. But it's the same caveat, right, that I have to give with this all the time, which is that the people who respond to a survey, who go to a WAN Summit event, especially the people who agree to do a 20 or 30-minute interview with my colleague Elizabeth Thorne and I, are really thinking about this, are really concerned with this. Not to say that others aren't thinking about it, but they just, the people who aren't responding to our surveys, aren't going to the conferences, might be in a position where they're more willing or to kind of turn that over to another party, or just not that interested in it in terms of what our respondents are, right? So the folks listening to this podcast care a lot about the marketplace and that sort of thing. So not everybody is going to want that kind of level of involvement, control. And so the larger market out there that aren't bothering to respond to our surveys might be more strongly leaning towards the managed service and are less likely to have adopted now, right? So what I'm getting at in a long-winded way there is that the long tail of later adopters strikes me as being much more likely to go with a kind of more fully managed solution, whereas the folks that got really interested in this, that have been reading up on it, going to conferences, meeting all the different vendors, they're more likely to be just the kind of person or group of people who want to retain more control, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, I think the key to vendor selection and management levels is knowing the landscape, knowing, like you mentioned before, what it came out of. Is this a service that came out of a WAN optimization shop or a security shop, and what are my priorities there, and how does that all work? And then, of course, you also need to know how much all of this costs, right? So
Everyone's favorite topic. How much
exactly,
is this
right.
going to cost me?
So on my, the folks who've read my blog posts about this or whatever, what I talk about mostly is the underlay costs, right? Like moving from all MPLS to a hybrid network and that sort of thing. But what your focus has been, Brianna, has been pricing for the SD-WAN service itself. So I want to close us out with talking about that. And the first place I wanted to go is, as I think back to 2017, or really even when we first were learning about, I think I basically first learned what SD-WAN was, or that it was a word, at the 2016 WAN Summit in New York. I don't know, maybe the 2015, if I recall that correctly. But the first thing I thought was, how on earth are we going to track this as an analyst shop? So take me through that challenge. What did it take to come up with a sort of standardized pricing that we could present to the world in a way that made sense to the vendors and to the consumers?
Yeah, it certainly was a challenge, a bit of a puzzle. SD-WAN still is. A lot of different vendors still take a very different approach to how they price it out. Originally, what we did was try to come up with a few core elements that we saw multiple vendors including in the pricing they outlined on their websites or in um, different articles we found. And then we shopped a survey around to
Hmm.
different SD-WAN vendors and said, would you be able to fill this in, and would it be a useful comparison to you? Because like so many of our other pricing products, a lot of the contributors also find the feedback useful to help benchmark themselves in the market. And so we did get input from a number of original SD-WAN vendors. We talked to a few of our consultant friends from the WAN Summit and put the survey in
Hmm.
front of them and kind of asked, is this what you're seeing when you're helping customers go through an SD-WAN deployment? And that was really helpful in putting together something that made sense.
Yeah,
Because
yeah. And there's an extent to which us doing that helps them congeal on a model that is makes sense and is transferable. If everyone is pricing things in a radically different way, the customer has trouble sort of figuring out which direction to go. So.
exactly. And I mean, still you see some that will weight their pricing more towards a non-recurring charge, so the investment in the SD-WAN hardware itself, whereas
Hmm.
others have shifted more towards a subscription-based um, pricing model. But overall, you are able to put these elements together and take a look at, okay, for each vendor, what is the total cost of your overlay, and make a pretty accurate comparison between the two.
Yeah, and what's been interesting for me to track, right, has been what percentage of the sort of total cost of ownership of a WAN SD-WAN has made up, and it's pretty small, right? So unless you're like a radical kind of internet only company, which there are very few people who, if even if they go all internet, they tend to include DIA, which is a whole different price level than business broadband. I haven't really seen a lot of real enterprises go like fully business broadband. If you had a fully business broadband network, your SD-WAN costs will take up a big portion of your total cost. But if you have any amount of MPLS, or your network is mostly DIA, still most of your cost is going to the underlay rather than the overlay. But having said that, I wonder if you could just lay out for us in real specific terms, kind of what are the elements of the total cost of an SD-WAN overlay across your network?
Sure. So the most common elements that we were able to identify kind of break into the non-recurring and the recurring charges. And so for the non-recurring charges, we've asked vendors to provide the upfront cost of an appliance or the software platform downloaded each network site for the enterprise. Um, and as I mentioned before, that can often be the bulkier costs for some vendors.
Hmm.
And in terms of the recurring charges, we're tracking software licensing fees. The key that was pointed out to us is the charge for total encrypted bandwidth at each network site. So
Hmm.
your MRC is going to increase as your network size increase, site size. And
Which is
also,
part of the point of SD-WAN, right? So
exactly.
if we in our WAN manager survey shows that the typical MPLS port size is still only 20 megs, which I'm sure most people listening to this podcast that live in an urban suburban area have 50, 100 plus megs at home, but the typical office with many employees and that sort of still only running 20 megs, partly just because MPLS is really expensive. But if you're going to add in a bunch of business broadband or DIA to accommodate the features of SD-WAN, it's going to be for that total amount, right? So
Mhm.
your MPLS plus your gigi DIA or whatever the case may be.
Exactly.
Got
And
it.
if we also look at both the unmanaged versus managed service pricing, and so for those managed services, also your management fees would be baked into those recurring charges as well.
Hmm. And let me just clarify one thing, because we're called TeleGeography. We think about space and place all the time. People know us for our maps. One of the key things in our career, you and I on the pricing team, has been understanding how different prices are around the world for everything transport, IP transit, colocation, data center space. SD-WAN doesn't work that way, which was kind of a
It was
surprise to
very
me. Yeah,
surprising. we
absolutely.
we sent out the original survey with all of these countries, and the prices came back all of the same. So we
So
definitely
encrypted
had to
throughput,
amend.
yeah. So encrypted throughput for your office in Johannesburg is the same as your office in Dubai, is the same as your office in London and New York. That's just something very different, very very different than how
Yes.
the underlay works, where prices are very far from flat. I mean, broadband's a little flatter. 100 megs of business broadband is not as extremely different in those more, but it's always going to be the case that IP transit is pretty different on the wholesale end. So those ISPs are still paying a little more for their IP transit in those hard to reach places, but not in SD-WAN. I guess because it's just all driven from the cloud out, and software based. And is there anyone that you talk to that differentiates by geography, or pretty much everyone just give you a global price?
We had one or two that
Hmm.
did say that for regions where it may be harder to ship the equipment physically,
Right,
they had
right.
baked in a little bit of a premium. So perhaps
Hmm.
Latin America or Africa was a little bit higher. But mostly across Asia, Europe, and the US, their prices were still pretty much the same. So, and they were the outlier, but it did kind of make sense that those harder to reach locations had a little bit of a premium baked
It
in.
makes sense to me. Yeah, I guess maybe it comes down to how one accounts for these sorts of things. I'm thinking of, like you mentioned, Latin America's markets like Argentina, where you basically pay like 100% tax on any IT equipment that you import, right? So
Yep.
so if somebody imports a box from Cisco, they pay for it twice. But I guess you could work that out in who pays the taxes, the customer, or whether the customer's paying it either way. But I guess the pricing wants to look the same regardless of whether they have to pay additional taxes or something.
Exactly.
But you would think that just the physical shipping, of course, obviously pushing the software around to different sort of data centers or whatever, maybe isn't that different of a cost on their end. But I still kind of am surprised by that a little bit. So
Probably worth following up on, but people
yeah,
have maintained that it's the same.
yeah, absolutely. And once you make it that way, it's going to be hard to ever go start charging more in your
Yeah.
harder markets. We have seen most rollouts still focused, though. I have to say, among the folks that we talk to on the enterprise side, most rollouts have been focused in North America and Western Europe for the time being. So perhaps as their costs maybe basis gets more visible, that will change. But I don't know. We'll see. So for cost differences, you mentioned managed services. What kind of breakouts have we done in the survey, and what are the different costs associated with that in terms of management levels?
Sure. So the managed service providers that we've profiled have taken a variety of approaches to it. Some offer just a single service tier, whereas others offer multiple. We've kind of broken it down into two to capture the differences between a basic and
Hmm.
higher level services. So we've got a basic managed SD-WAN service, which includes all of those management fees as well as just your basic network monitoring and security features. And then that premium solution, I should say that the basic managed SD-WAN could be a co-managed or a fully managed solution, whereas the
Ah, right,
premium is definitely a fully managed solution with more
right.
advanced network features. So we've tried to capture some of those distinctions that the managed SD-WAN vendors um, are using in their pricing models.
And the differences, right? So if first between the real IT heavy companies that want to absolutely be on their own. If you go up to that next step, which, like I said, is emerging as the most popular one in our most recent survey of kind of your co-managed, where you retain some control but are having some features, especially like I said, the 24/7 kind of coverage done by your vendor. What kind of markup are we looking at in terms of the SD-WAN service?
When we've taken a look at it, a premium managed service can be 2 to 3 times that of a
Mm,
basic managed
right.
SD-WAN service,
So it
which
makes a big difference. Yeah.
it does. But to your point, whereas SD-WAN makes up such a small piece of the total network cost, I know
Right.
you've pointed out in your blog post that even if you are increasing the cost of the SD-WAN overlay 2 to 3 times, if you're able to get those savings as part of the underlay, you are seeing your total costs go down.
Absolutely. Right. And the key thing that I think we'll want to be thinking about over the coming years is that once you get used to something, it's very quickly that sort of little jolt of happiness you get goes away, and then you're just in a new normal, right? So
Yes.
if I leave behind my MPLS and cut my network costs in half, then from that just becomes the new normal, and maybe later on I become more sensitive to having 3x of my SD-WAN costs for management or something. So I wonder if in the long run that has a
It
deeper effect on people. We'll see.
it could. It makes sense.
Yeah. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about is, as I said, at TeleGeography, we like to focus on how things have developed over space, but we also talk about how they've developed over time, right? So we've been tracking SD-WAN prices for a few years now, and we've been tracking the what has now become the underlay. We just used to call it transport or the WAN or whatever, right? But we've been tracking that for more than a decade, right? So we understand really well how prices develop on the underlay side. Is that the same for SD-WAN? And this is one where I'm genuinely curious in the midst of this interview to see what you have to say here. Like, what kind of movement do we see in the underlay? We expect routinely across the globe that prices fall 15, 20, even 25, 30%, depending on the location every single year. Is that true for SD-WAN?
It isn't. This is one that's similar to geography when we saw the results
Mm-hmm.
with
Right.
kind of very much surprised me with the way it played out. We actually haven't seen SD-WAN prices decrease all that much. A
Mm-hmm.
majority
Mm-hmm.
of the vendors that we have surveyed for multiple years this year said they had no change in their pricing. Those that did clarified why. A few were moving over more towards a subscription based service. So they were really shifting their costs
Mm.
towards the MRC from the NRC. And others said that they had decided to cut pricing to come in line with lower price competitors in the market. But it was very few vendors that did shift
Mm-hmm.
pricing over the past year. So I think maybe prices
Yeah, we'll see.
overall decrease 1 or 2%. That's it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, that makes a certain amount of sense to me. If you compare it more, it's not really a telecom service. It's more like kind of a software service. In telecom, you're facing that constant pressure that advances in the technology at those layers 1, 2, and 3, right? Get more supply out of every bit of wire that's laid all around the earth every year, right? So, and they're always increasing the supply of wires at the same time. So as much as demand grows, the supply has always grown faster. Maybe not quite the same dynamic in SD-WAN, where it's kind of more like a software, more like a service. So that'll be interesting to see. Yeah.
It will be. We're gearing up for another round of pricing. So we'll see what comes in this year if anyone has decided to shift around.
Yeah. So then if internet prices inevitably continue to fall at their standard, 15, 20%, and SD-WAN prices don't, and MPLS wanes in popularity,
Does the
eventually
SD-WAN
yeah,
become a
SD
big portion of your
exactly.
network cost?
Yeah, eventually the WAN is just SD-WAN, or maybe some other time we'll talk about what you're looking into now with network as a service and that kind of stuff. There'll be no more WAN someday anyway, right? So, I don't know.
And
As as long,
it'll be
yeah.
interesting to see where it goes. I know that some
Hmm.
of the vendors we've talked to are even wondering what happens to SD-WAN. Does performance-based routing just kind of become another tool in the toolbox of kind of a network as a service product? It's not just standalone SD-WAN anymore. But we'll see.
Right, right, exactly. That ultimately everything is just down to how you get it to go over your IP pipe, basically, right?
Exactly.
Okay, Brianna, that was really interesting. I know that I actually learned a couple of things about what you guys have done on that project. It's been telegeography has grown in so many different directions that I can't keep up with everything that we're doing now. So it's really cool to get back into some of the stuff that I haven't been able to work directly on. So thank you.
Anytime.
So now, before we leave here, I really like to ask everybody an unrelated question of the episode. And I was thinking for you, it might be fun to see like what is it that you are most missing during the lockdown. So where we are here in Virginia, we're pretty close, I think, to opening some things up. So although it may be dependent on what you want to do, but what are you going? What's the first thing you're going to do once life sort of returns to normal here?
Well, I don't know if jumping on a plane is necessarily the first thing I want to do, but
Yeah.
my family is all up in Massachusetts on Cape Cod. And
Mm,
so this time of year, I'm really missing being up there with them, kind of going to the beach.
get some beach time. Yeah. Well,
Exactly.
you need to
But
rent an RV. That's like the safe way to travel, right?
we could.
I like that
Just
we could. That was a little, well, we could.
that'd be quite a road trip with my 2-year-old toddler and husband dog in all that.
Indeed. Yeah, I don't
That
even know how the car seat works in the RV. So, yeah. Yeah.
no, but going to the beach, seeing family, those are two things that I would love to do right about now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully soon enough. And with that, thank you so much for joining us. It's been super fun. And hopefully, maybe in the future, you can come back, talk about network as a service or whatever new things you come up with next there. So
Of course, anytime. Have a great day, Greg.
awesome. You too. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks very much for listening. The WAN Manager podcast is brought to you by TeleGeography, a division of Primetrica Incorporated, and is edited and produced by Jane Miller. I wrote the theme song you're listening to right now, and we get administrative canine support from my dog Honeybun, who you might hear chiming in from time to time when the mood strikes her. If you want to learn more about our data, head over to telegeography.com, where you can find our blog that covers many of the topics we hit here, and you can sign up for our WAN Manager newsletter. Until next time, have a great day. Boom. Yeah. All right. How's it going?
It's going okay. Is it enough banter? That's what I was wondering.
You can always do more banter, so I'll work on
Okay.
that too.